Okay, welcome everyone to the Arreoblue Podcast, talking about all things data. And today I'm joined by Dirk Anderson. So actually, Dirk has been a friend of Arreoblue for some time now, one of the first people actually that we reached out to for some advice as he was going through CEO as BlakYaks and the journey that they've been on, and they're now a product company. Dirk, great to have you on. If you want to just quickly introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I think you've covered some of it, Stephen. We've known each other for about 4 or 5 years now. I head up the BlakYaks business, CEO in that business, which means I run the whole team. Relatively young company, Microsoft partner, pure play partner, just like Arreoblue are, with a very specific focus on building, managing enterprise-grade Azure platforms. So yeah, boring, narrow but deep. That's what we do.
Brilliant. Well, I'm sure we'll talk about, it's one of the last topics actually, to talk a little bit about, boutiques and startups, and it's really nice actually having that thin beer. But before skipping ahead to that, I guess some of the things we were going to cover is really talk about AI and, the transformation that we've both seen, I guess, from our side on the data, but from your side is building cloud native platforms and the kind of impact that it's had. So where do you see the market currently going?
I think there's lots of experimentation going on in the market. So I see just lots of individual use cases, and I suspect that most businesses don't quite appreciate how broadly AI tools of varying types are being used across their own businesses. We see some really serious experimentational stuff that's going on within data science, analytics teams alongside developers and DevOps teams. And you see some of those really make their way onto a back-end platform that's well-governed, well managed. I think that's the exception to the norm. What I see predominantly right now are those individual productivity cases with some kind of back-end experimental stuff. And I know we're going to cover some of that in a bit more depth.
Yeah, and certainly that element of the pilot trap and how people can overcome it, and quite often uncovering some of the things that are baseline that prevent them. But so based on your own experience, where do you see people currently on that AI journey?
So I think there's less top-down driven stuff from the board than I think is required to get these projects from experiment and sandbox into mainstream production and with the right guardrails in place. So I think there's a job for enterprise architects to play that they may have picked up on already. Some may have not. So I think there's a role that, it's certainly in large businesses that enterprise architects need to play a renewed role for them in stitching what's going on in the boardroom and what their aspirations are around AI back into the cloud teams and the infrastructure teams that ultimately are going to deliver and support the service. So I think the industry and the market at large is just still figuring that stuff out. Yeah. We see some exceptions to that, which we can talk about, but I think largely people are trying to get their ducks in a row. And what policies do they need? How do they govern what's in use and what's not in use? But I've got some, I guess, relatively strong views on the path that I think people need to walk to start to get that stuff right.
Yeah, brilliant. It's a really good point because we see that. Obviously from a technology standpoint, people leaning on the enterprise architecture function for what should we do, how should we do it, and we've seen quite a lot of the. I know because obviously you're talking like cloud native platforms. We see quite a lot of this T-shaped stuff coming in with AI solutions because obviously vendors have their own thing.
Yeah,
people will get very accustomed to what the vendor has. So quite often, actually, the role that we find ourselves playing, as I'm sure you do, is that how we help people navigate.
Yep.
From pillar to pillar and do it appropriately.
Yeah, I've got a slightly different take on that, but the reason we're keen on working with partners like Arreoblue, I think you're, pardon the pun, but very crisp about what it is you do and how you support customers. I think we're equally sharp about the bit that we do and how those things, I think, stitch together at what stage is important to me. So if you're old enough, you'll remember there was an old network acronym called ICMP, Internet Control Message Protocol. I've kind of stolen that for how I think about the AI market and the process to get from experimentation all the way through to production, with the I being, I suppose, the individual component, which is just individual productivity. I think it's safe to say that most people have gone out of their own free will and found a variety of different AI tools that allows them to be more productive, whether that's quicker or better outcomes, and they'll be using those tools today without good governance and policy and standards and all that sort of stuff. I think there's then the C part of that, where what will fall out, if you think about, I think about it as a bit of a funnel, Stephen. So I, on the left-hand side, lots of individual use cases and productivity use cases. Then you get to see which, somebody's created some critical business component. It might be one function, it might be a set of functions, but it's underpinned by AI and large language models, and you've got to think then more seriously about what do I do with that to govern it and manage it in its life cycle. I think as you progress onwards now and you wind it out a year or so, I think we're going to have many. So the M part of that is the many cases that have come from that individual experimentation. And I think what leaders have got to do is be really careful about allowing kind of shadow IT on speed, if that makes sense. Is not, don't get yourself into a position where you've got all these critical functions that are starting to appear. There's many of them consumed by many people, whether it's internal customers, external customers, because at some point you've got to get to a platform that and an architecture, really solid AI foundations that provides, I think, everything you need to apply governance framework across all of your AI workloads. Hopefully, I know I ramble at that. Hopefully, that makes some sense. But
no, it's brilliant, and we see loads of stuff around that, right? So the whole architecture piece, putting the right frameworks in place, helping people with the security and the robustness. So, Rob, one of our guys, he always talks because data governance. I guess we're talking quite often about the data that underpins, but obviously you talk about the cloud architectures. And one of the things he always says is the reason a Formula One car can go so fast is because it's got good brakes and good aerodynamics, so you can control it, which means you can go fast around. I guess just getting your view on how leaders balance that appetite for creativity along with that security and robustness.
I think, to start with, intentionally, I think you've got to be well intended about getting that right. You certainly want to not preclude people from using all of those AI tools that are out there with some governance and guardrails and policy that restricts what they can and can't do. Don't go and put your customers' data inside a public AI tool. So there's some obvious stuff like that I think you've got to get right to allow the experimentation to happen. But I think there then needs to be a clear path to get from there to production workloads where I guess the guardrails and the gating processes and the approvals and all the policies that we may have applied to data sets and to application landscapes for the last 20 years now needs to kind of be applied to AI workloads. What I'm really looking for, Stephen, is the likes of Arreoblue to deal with all of that heavy lifting at the front so that we can focus much more on the platform at the back end and how do we stand up those environments so that you can safely get from experimentation to production and trust. There's a whole broad piece around that. How do you create? How do you govern? How do you control? How do you apply policies? What does the lifecycle management need to look like in an enterprise mature environment to wrap all of the right stuff around that? So I think that's kind of the process for me.
Yeah, it's brilliant. We do definitely. We have a whole piece that we'll often talk about around some of that responsible AI component, which is actually it's all doing some of that stuff up front. So how you mentioned with the pilot trap, you don't get your way through a project and then realise this could even just be an ethical thing. Actually, we shouldn't do that because of X, Y, Z.
And I think on that point, right, I think you'll see two. I think, and this is only my own personal view, you'll see two different sets of behaviour. So you have private sector who'll be very profit and bottom line driven, that are going to take every opportunity to use AI, and in cases may well be displacing a lot of white collar worker and activities that those folks may have carried out, all the way through to, I think, public sector would be more reticent, because ultimately if you displace jobs it goes into the system, and there's a concern, I don't want to be dramatic to call it an existential threat, but I think you have to think really seriously about the volume of jobs that could get replaced and what are you going to do about that. I think there'll be lots that will be created, but I don't think it'll be a one for one.
No, and it's interesting because I have seen a little bit of that lens, because we've done some work in the public sector, and actually their focus is definitely not on replacing, but bringing up the citizen services, making it quicker for people to be able to access and broadening the ability for people to access rather than,
Yeah,
like you say.
I think they'll be more considered, Stephen, about and intentional about how do you not do that. Whereas I think privately held businesses are less inclined. I think that's the reality.
Yep. So, talking to the next topic, really building that consistent route from pilot to production.
Yeah.
And it would be brilliant to share some views on that. You know, what sort of things slows companies down, and what things have you seen that they can put in place so actually they can speed up that acceleration?
My own experience is that companies are late to really think about what really strong foundations look like. Open about the fact that I only work in the Azure space, so I can talk about kind of what we do at platform level. There's a whole bunch of things, so I think people were very quick to use easily consumable services like OpenAI to stand something up and make it available to subsets of the business. And then there's an integration of Foundry, but I think there's a whole bunch of other stuff around that. Like, how do you keep all of that private? What data sets? And I know you know this stuff better than I do, Stephen, but what data sets are you going to allow to come into the mix? How do you control which versions of large language models people can and can't use? If you really want to be clear on what people are using it for within your business, how do you turn on verbose logging and capture all of that? I think if you're getting that architecture right, you need to make sure it's very API centric so that developers, data scientists, machine learning folks can consume in a consistent way through an API layer, which in an Azure context, you're thinking about then APIM, and then you've got private DNS and private keys and a security architecture and a role-based access model. All of the stuff that you would do for an application landscape, I think, is the same for AI workloads with some extra bits on top, because the minute I think there's a different challenge between introducing data sets into that environment that you have control of and you have an appreciation of what's in there and what isn't in there. The minute you're introducing external data sets that you don't have control of, maybe market data feeds, and you're building models that are anticipating those data sets look in a particular way, I think there's a bit more curation, if that's the right word, involved in understanding. And also from from a lifecycle management standpoint, if Microsoft are about to change some of those back-end components, or any cloud vendor, I think you need to be ahead of that. You need to test for that, do some regression testing. So I think you need to treat that a bit like the application landscape. So we, certainly at BlakYaks, we've got an architecture all built in code that we stand up rapidly for customers so that they can make that leap from dev to pilot to production more quickly, and try and take some of that challenge away from the companies that we're serving. That's our role.
Yeah, brilliant, and definitely like some of these accelerators that can help people move on quicker. And it is funny what you mentioned there, because we find ourselves a lot on the data side talking about data governance, and there have been public cases, right, of more information going in than was perhaps understood, and then the impact that can have. I guess another thing is we're seeing this. It's really funny, the similarities that you're drawing between software engineering disciplines and this wave of AI. And actually, more and more, we're looking at projects. And yes, there's some healthy stuff with data, but a lot of this is based on integrations, right, and integration patterns.
Sure, yeah.
So probably just sharing your views on that would be interesting.
Yeah, we're BlakYaks very strong advocates of treating both environments broadly the same in terms of lifecycle management. As a company that only build platforms with code and manage them entirely with code, the same applies to AI platforms, AI architectures, and AI workloads. So when we deploy these architectures, the integrations have got to exist. So they're all deployed in a highly modular way, but we need to have dealt with all the integration that exists between that half a dozen components and others, right? So there might be third-party systems, there might be third-party AI tools, there might be different application gateways that a particular customer favors. We want to make sure that all of that integration is dealt with up front. Because, as you said, Stephen, you don't want to be a blocker to accelerating from pilot and into production. And the minute you've got to wrestle with the next bit of integration, when you're ready to deploy, I think is a problem for you. So we give a lot of thought to what are all those integrations up front before the first AI workload or data set is in there to be managed. But we do rely, certainly as a business, we rely on partners like Arreoblue to deal with some of the data challenges and also some of the business analysis challenges, with a very hard focus on how do we build those platforms and treat them with those good software lifecycle management, always plugged into good DevOps, DevSecOps type process, MLOps, AIOps. I think you're kind of knocking on quite an open door when you're dealing with large customers, because they already have a very strong appreciation of all of that stuff. I think mid-size and down, there's naturally a bit more education there. So I think we can all help walk that path.
Yeah. I mean, and Dirk, you talked earlier about, some of the frameworks and the ability to, well, you mentioned with the vendors, and things are changing so fast, right? Like one of the things that we can do as boutiques is provide architectures where things can be dropped in and out, and we can give people some of that flexibility that they don't paint into a corner when, a new model comes out or a component like that. And equally, actually, another piece that I don't know if you see this, but we often, in that enterprise space, the appreciation for ML ops and some of the data ops stuff which we'd work in, and actually then starting to watch some of that discipline as stuff gets democratized, watching some of the discipline be asked for by the business with a little bit of shaping, right? So it's not quite IT DevOps.
And I guess some of that comes with a transfer of responsibility and accountability at the point someone realises they're the custodian. If things go wrong, they'll be asked why that's gone wrong. And I think that transfer of ownership means that people are much more likely to demand the sort of rigour that maybe they enjoyed not having prior to having ownership, is how I think about it, which is just maturity.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, look, our final topic, and one that we could probably spend ages talking about, is your experience with startups and the journey that you've been on. And I guess any tips, and you've certainly given us some tips over the time, any tips that you'd have for others that are perhaps looking at the journey?
Wow, so it's a whole podcast series, isn't it? It's going to be 6 episodes in its own right. I think top tips, and there's a lot inside each one of these points and comments, but I think you have to have a network, Stephen. You need to have people where you can make a bit of a soft landing with, people who implicitly already trust you because they're good work in the industry, your reputation, you're credible, authentic. So if you've got your first customers coming from your network, I think that's a massive plus, and that's easier said than done. I think that's all built before you go into the kind of startup mode. And likewise, I think some of your key hires have to come from that network as well. So if you can get that right, well, network you can rely on both sides. I think that's really important for anybody starting. I think you've got to know your market. I think we're both been lucky that we know that market that we serve exists already because of prior experience. Yours at Microsoft, mine's at Red Pixie, then HP. So it was pretty clear the market was there, and what you're really looking for is your place in that market. So I think I make that point because I think some people go into the market not quite understanding what it is about them that customers might be interested in, and what differentiates, whether it's having great people in your team, which I've kind of been blessed with, and I think you're the same. But you've got to know what you're about, right? Where it's high quality standards, and stick to your target market, the right audience. I think know what you do, stay away from the stuff that you don't do really well. I think it's a lot of businesses, especially right at the start, it's really easy to take revenue that kind of keeps the wolves from the door. I would advocate to try and avoid that and have enough seed funding to really get on with the stuff that's good. And I think more important than all of that is good culture, good team. So I think you get the right people into your business, you build it quicker if that's right. And I think customers feel that. I think the culture and the team ethic and how you behave and how you present yourselves inside the business is absolutely what the customer should see as well. But I think there's a whole podcast episode around all of those subjects that they're quite deep.
Yeah, definitely. I do remember. I was talking to you really early on, and you gave like some of that advice there actually on. You are in the boutique world. That experience that a customer gets and that reference ability and that confidence, that's all you really have necessarily to go on to the next piece. And I remember we came with we've got this opportunity in our target market, in our target state, but to do it, we're going to be a little bit stretched. And I asked, what would you do, Dirk? And I remember you saying, if it's in the target market and it's your target thing, you've just got to find a way. That's how you'll build the reputation. So
I think it's a whole episode around why some startups might be unlucky and fail, Stephen. And I think some of that can be about not doing stuff like that. I don't think you can do it. I don't think you can do it half. You've got to be all in. I think customers see that quite quickly. I've seen businesses that have tried to start by guys contracting, trying to give a little bit of time. I think you've got to be all in. And it's hard, right, getting off the runway when you have no trading history, no previous customers. The first customer has to take a bet on you. Mm-hmm. And I think once you've got one or two of those, and especially if they're kind enough to give you some reference points, I think it starts to take care of itself. But getting in the air is quite difficult if you're starting and never done it before.
Yeah, I think with certainly for us with some of our early clients, that very sort of partnershipy feel that you have. I think they know exactly where you're at, right? And they've taken a bit of a chance on you, but they know they're going to get a lot in return because you are everything
very
for them.
Invested. Yeah.
Yes, you certainly are.
Yeah, and I think that mustn't stop because that's kind of what your customers expect you to behave like for the next 5-10 years, right?
Well, and it's driven into your values, therefore, isn't it? That focus on, are we delivering value?
Yeah.
Is the forever question that we're asking, right? And if we don't think we're delivering the value to our standards, then we'll question it and we'll have an open conversation with the client on, do you want us to change the scope, the deliverable? This feels like something better for you.
Be honest with them, I guess, is always a really good policy. Do what you're good at, know what you're a specialist in, stick to that if you can.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's any closing thoughts that you have that you wanted to share?
No, it's been a pleasure to see you and the Arreoblue team grow so quickly. Real success story, and thanks for having me on.
Oh well, thank you for all your support there.
No worries. Cheers. Yep.
Yeah.